April. How you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Thanks for joining me and talking all things social media, tech platforms, and where we are today and where we need to be going. So there's going to be a lot to talk about.
I was gonna say that's a lot.
I am really looking forward to speaking with you because you have a very specific expertise in kind of dating apps and also how algorithms kind of sort people here and there and everywhere. But you also, of course, are theorists of technology in general. And I think that people have a lot to learn from you. Before we get into specifics, can you just tell me a little bit how you got interested in the politics of algorithms and dating apps? Like, was this a personal thing for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, like the personal is political, but also this was really personal. Like I was using dating apps and I was having a wild time. Like depending on where it was. I could be in Texas and it was not a great time because it was pretty conservative, or like DC, Baltimore, Chocolate City, and having a great time. I was like, what is happening here? Or even in Seattle where there's not a whole bunch of black folks, but I would still have a ton of matches. So I was like, what's happening where the algorithm is not algorithming for me in certain places. I started to think, is it related to race? Or is it just geography? Right. And the answer is really, it turns out to be both. But at the time when I first started this, I was like, I got to figure out what's behind the scenes. And that was in 2015. So about 10 years ago, when I really first started thinking about how do these programs actually work. Surely it's not the case that we just like open the app and they're showing us everyone who's around us, which is what they sort of tell us is what they're doing. But that's actually not the case, of course.
Yes, there's always an issue of transparency, I think, behind all these tech questions that we have, and people just really not knowing what is going on. And so it breeds all this confusion and sometimes anger, justifiably so. I'm curious then, like, how you started to explore this. Like, where did you start and where did it take you?
Yeah, so the first time I really started thinking about it was at ASA. I was at a plenary, which is the American Sociological Association. I was at their annual meeting, and Aziz Ansari was there along with the co-founder of OkCupid and eHarmony. And they were joking about, if you think your matches are ugly, it's probably because you're ugly. And I was like, excuse me? What does that mean, And they went on to explain, like, let's say you're an eight, you're gonna see mostly eights out of a 10, maybe occasionally a seven or a nine, but you're mostly gonna see people who are in your same rank. And they made it seem really cut and dry. And after all these years of digging, of course, I found out that that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, I remember reading some New York Magazine piece years ago where they were interviewing like the most popular people on one of those matchy kind of apps. And they were talking about like they had a strategy around gaming the algorithm of like swiping right more often so that they would get matched, so that they would be higher ranked in this system or something. Like they weren't actually using the apps in the ways that they were supposed to be using them. And I'm curious, like, if you have found in general that these algorithms are kind of a game. Like these tech companies are playing a game, playing games with people.
I mean, yes, yeah. So definitely tech companies are playing a game, but then also I think the users enjoy the gamified experience. That's part of it, is that you can be swiping and it can feel non-committal and sort of just cathartic. You're having fun, you're seeing who you connect with. But on the flip side, users also really get in their feelings about it, honestly, because it does say something, or at least people perceive that it says something about your attractiveness and your value and your desirability. So, yes, it's all fun and games until it's not. And then people's feelings are hurt. And I think often we think of like, oh, online dating, it's just like a hookup culture, but it's really not. More and more increasingly, people are using online dating to find their life mate, their partner. And it often leads to serious relationships, even from so called hookup apps. And so the fact that it is very gamified and that we're sort of encouraged into this space of play when we are talking about like a longer term commitment is really interesting. I read this article, I believe it was in Fast Company years ago, also about a guy who went and visited Tinder HQ. And he found that, or he asked them to see his ranking, like his score in the system. And he was not pleased with his score. He was kind of sad about it. He was like, oh, I'm just a regular average dude, which most of us are just like regular average people. But I think that we have this perception that we maybe score higher than the average user. But even he, knowing the system and sort of understanding how it worked, was that it's not just about your attractiveness, but it's also about how often you open the app, how often you engage with other people. There is sort of like a ranking system that goes into it, but a lot of it is ultimately based on your features and how they align with like heteronormative Western beauty standards.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like what you're really researching is that intersection between the technology, but also our cultural norms and how those are so deeply intertwined when people, I think, often think, oh, the technology is neutral and I'm just ranked how I am because of whatever, because of the culture, because of something outside of the technology. And part of what I think you've been arguing, right, is that those are actually inextricably linked.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the technology comes from us. We're the culture. So the tech is necessarily going to have the same kind of biases that we as humans have as individuals. All of the ideas and culture that we have about who we're supposed to date, who we're supposed to marry, who we should stay away from, like attracts like, black people should be with black people, white people should be with white people, right? Like all this ideology that we carry or maybe don't carry, maybe we've deconstructed it, but we hear it in our popular culture and we see it in film and in television. These things are not just existing out here. And then you have dating apps. The people who create dating apps also live in the society and they're reflecting that reality in their programming. And ultimately, that reality we know is just a representation of what people think it should be. What even is reality, right? So, the representation that we see in mediascapes is not necessarily true to life. And unfortunately, these ideologies, like these sort of dominant narratives and culture, get baked into the technology. And then as users, as we're swiping and sort of playing into the system, unfortunately, we uphold those beliefs as well, unless we're really doing the work to unpack it and sort of stop and say, okay, what am I doing when I swipe?
Yeah, that New York Magazine piece that I saw years ago, it was unsurprising that the like most popular people on this app were like white, blonde, thin, like fit, conventionally attractive in the ways that we see on film and TV. They like literally could have been actors. Um,
Right.
and maybe that makes sense to people. But it also seems like there could be another way, right? That we could actually have a different way of relating through technology.
Absolutely. It seems like really it could be that you just walk into a bar model. It could be what it sort of promises to be, which is like you open the app and it shows you everybody within a 5 mile radius or 10 mile radius, whatever you want it to be. And then you just swipe through those people. And sure, maybe it's nice to have a little bit of compatibility algorithm or whatever that sort of says to you, oh, you and this person are like minded along X, Y, and Z factors. I'm not opposed to something like that, but that's not what's happening. And it's actually way more complicated and very much so rooted in these racial politics of desirability and beauty and attractiveness.
Yeah, I was on dating apps, before there was social media. Like, as a gay person, we kind of always use the internet to find each other. And so I remember feeling very unattractive, but also that there was like always this like chance, because this is before algorithms, right? There was always this chance possibility that I could just be near someone who maybe I wouldn't have connected with otherwise. And I think that did happen early on. And it was really important to my self-esteem. And I think there are today maybe some queer apps that still do that kind of just like organic. these are just the people around you, no matter who they are, what they look like. But even those are starting to mess with that a little bit and put in more kind of algorithmic recommendation systems within them, because I guess it does kind of keep people coming back to the app, um, and like using it and playing with it, like kind of gamified thing, um, which I think is highly problematic. I know that you also have been thinking about how do we do better, and I want to get to that, but I first want to take a bigger step back and get to that kind of earlier social media in general moments and ask you, um, you know, what is your relationship to these connective digital technologies? And have you always believed that they were something that were useful to you and something that maybe could even bring value to your life? Or have you kind of always been skeptical? Yeah.
Yeah, so I really see technology as just an extension of our social lives. It's a tool like anything else. I tend to think of technology as neutral. We can use it for good or we can use it for not good. And often it's the case that people do both. Like we see people doing both all the time. And for me, it's just another way to connect. And I see it as an extension of just like our evolution as humans. We are able to maintain long distance relationships with our family, with our kin, with our partners, whoever, with our children, because we have like these new mediated technologies which help us to facilitate communication. And I don't see dating apps as any different than that. But I do find them, I would say, I guess I'm apprehensive about the direction in which they're going, because they're taking away that connection piece often is facilitating a quick interaction, or quick decision making, but it's not necessarily facilitating human connection.
Yeah. I feel like when I was in my early 20s and social media was new, I had this hope and belief that this would like connect the world and bridge divides and we would all become a global civilization and kumbaya and all that stuff. And it seems like we've moved far from that. But do you think that that has happened, that there have been like real value from these? And in what ways? What are some examples that you think really highlight the positive potential of these connective technologies?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about social media, I think that Black Lives Matter is a huge example of a success where yes, people maybe have varied views about the movement and how to participate in the movement. We were able to actually see in real time, this is the information, this is where this is happening. Be there or don't, but at least you have the info. And then, of course, in my other research on Karens, I've talked a lot about how social media and memes and Black Twitter in particular really hold a space for holding white women accountable for the things that they're doing, especially when they're engaging in sort of like race-based harassment, not sort of, when they're engaging in race-based harassment of folks of color, especially Black people in public spaces. And the memification of those folks really does serve as a sort of social sanctioning where sometimes we don't have any other way of saying this is a boundary violation. This is a norm violation. This is unethical. This is not moral. And we want you to receive punishment for that. Sometimes social media justice is the only way that we get justice.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think so many Black people have those experiences where they're just like, am I really having this experience right now? Like, is this real? Like, if someone was recording this and showed this to the world, would they agree that this is wrong? Because there are these like really complicated social and cultural interactions that we have. And when we don't see things and talk about things, then people don't have language to actually say, no, this is actually messed up. And you can approach that person and say, hey, what you're doing is like this thing that we have talked about, right? I have had on the streets of Chicago white women threatened to call the police on me for literally like doing nothing in my my own business. Um, and it's interesting. The last time that happened, I did kind of just look at her and I said my name and where I worked, and I was like, "I'm a professor. Like, this is what's going on. Like, you actually don't know me or what's happening." And I think I kind of, it was in that discourse moment, like when social media was like kind of popping off. And I have to think that she looked at herself and made the calculation of like, if I call the police on the wrong Black person, will I be dragged on Black Twitter and my career will be over? I found out later that she was like also a professor and like
Oh,
I think didn't want the reputational risk if anything was public. And I just don't know if that would have happened 10 years prior, you know?
for sure.
So I agree with you that like we think about memes as these like silly things, but they do have this way of starting a discourse, right? And like changing the nature of the conversation, at least amongst some people. And you've actually
Definitely.
like analyzed that and like shown how memes actually are these like really rich discursive spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we often just think like, oh, we're doing it for the laughs. And sometimes we are doing it for the laughs, but because we need to laugh to get through the pain. And it's like everybody knows that this is wrong. But laughing about it helps us sort of process, right? It's sort of like we're laughing because this is so ridiculous that this just keeps happening. And often the things that people do when they're coined a Karen, or when they're called a Karen is really like fantastical, audacious wildness that we're seeing in these videos where people are really acting out. And so, yeah, it's funny. The things that they're doing are funny. But what's not funny is that if they call the police and say, a black man is threatening me, and the police come and we end up dead, that's not funny. And I think people do understand that. I know that there is this sort of like, there's a discourse about whether or not it's healthy to have these sort of like laugh out loud moments on socials when we're talking about racial justice and social justice. But I think people are smart enough to understand and sort of decode when we're being serious, we're being serious. And when we're being funny, we're being funny. And we can be funny because it didn't get serious, because no one ended up dead. We can be funny while also saying this could have been that.
Yeah, totally. Um, I think that something happened maybe in the course of you doing that original study where these platforms over the past, 10 years or so have gotten kind of more algorithmic than they used to be. And maybe also, I don't know, like less connective in some way and more kind of clout chasey or something. I'm curious, like what, just in general with social media, have you noticed these trends of like those more potentially socially transformative aspects are getting hindered by the way the platforms are scaling?
Yeah, I really think that monetization and the rise of influencer culture has really shifted the way that we commune together online. Because every influencer or content creator is trying to achieve monetized status, right? Like they want to be paid for their labor. A lot of their content gets tailored to be super niche. And it's not necessarily about building a community for the sake of community. It's about building a following so they can make money, which I totally support and respect. Like, get your bag. I really do. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily facilitate a space where we can all have two-way, multi-directional conversation. It's really an audience that's consuming, a representation of someone, a portrayal, which is entertaining and sometimes can be informative. Like certainly TikTok right now is a lifeline for me. I look at the news and then I go and actually look at the news, right? Like I get the news on TikTok and then I verify it elsewhere. Um, so there are uses for it still, but it's not the same where we could say we were having a community dialogue, especially where with platforms like TikTok, they're going to put the most popular comments at the top. So it's not like any random person can just jump into the conversation and say, hey, I think this. Um, TikTok just not set up that way.
Yeah, and I think TikTok really took off in post 2020 in the pandemic, in part because everyone says it's like that sorting mechanism, how they govern visibility, either like what TikToks you see, or even like I'm sure the comments as well are kind of algorithmic in some way. The ones that are getting the most engagement get bumped up to the top or whatever. Seems to be key to its success, but also seems to be maybe causing some issues with people feeling like they're part of a community and it's more like an entertainment platform
Hmm.
than it is like an actual like social media space. Um, Do you chalk that up to the algorithm? Do you chop it up to capitalism? Is it both? Is there something else I'm missing? What is challenging people who actually want to have real conversations on social media from having them?
Yeah, I think it is both. I think it's the capitalism where people are realizing that the systems that we have historically relied on to accumulate wealth just aren't working anymore. We are strapped with debt, which we are never going to get dismissed or paid off. Who knows? People spend all these times accumulating debt in college, getting a master's, and then come out on the other side to find that, their entry level job as a teacher pays $45,000 a year. And now they have this mountain of debt. And it's like, why would I do that when I could just be an influencer and make 100K sitting at home from my house and be less stressed out and not catching germs from all these sick kids and not have to deal with their parents who don't parent at home, right? Like, there's so many things, there's so many layers. And it's just like, of course, people are turning to the path of least resistance and also the path that's financially just as smarter. So I think that's part of it. But then also because of this shift where everyone is sort of like on the hustle, there is so much emphasis on consuming that productive content or being entertained, that it's hard to say like, oh, I want to have this community. I will say on Threads, it feels like the old days of Twitter. It's kind of refreshing. I'm scared to put it out there because I think monetization is coming soon. And I think that they're going to have ads soon and it's really going to change a lot. But right now, it's giving Black Twitter 2012, and I'm living for it. I'm seeing actual community. People are having conversations, people are organizing, people are teaching each other things. I'm learning how to sew on Threads. I'm
Okay.
learning, yes. I mean, I also take a class, but I'm getting all the tips and tricks from the folks on Threads as well. So I think people are really able to communicate more freely there because of that lack of monetization, where it's not just you're only seeing the people who have paid or are getting paid at the top of the stack.
Yeah, I love how you pointed out how this platform that is owned by a big corporation seems to have this moment where real conversation can actually happen because they haven't yet monetized it. And indeed, like I don't think I've seen an ad on Threads. Like if they have put ads on there, I haven't seen any.
No, I haven't seen ads either.
Um, which it seems like intentional on their part. It's not like Meta, which owns Threads, doesn't have an ad sales team.
Right. Exactly.
They know that in order to build people's trust in the platform and get them to engage meaningfully, they don't want to commercialize it. They know that it is the commercialization that kind of crushes the vibe in a certain kind of way.
Yeah,
Um, so that's really interesting. I hadn't heard anyone spotlight that before because it is algorithmic. I mean,
for sure.
it's not just a time-based feed.
Oh, definitely. I will say, like, my posts get the most play when I post in the morning.
Mm.
So, just when people are like checking for the day, you're like, wake up and you do your morning scroll or whatever. But yeah, it is mostly just like, oh, we're all just here vibing. Like, I follow maybe a few people who have over 50,000 followers, but for the most part, everyone has like 3,000 followers on Threads, and there's lots of mutuals.
I love that you're pointing out this, like, once people start getting into the millions of followers, the vibe starts to shift because
Oh, definitely.
you're broadcasting at that point. You're not talking.
Right. You're a brand at that point. Like, you're not having a conversation. You're definitely a brand and you're just broadcasting information.
And, it brings up to me this like kind of seemingly very simple idea that people can get, which is like as humans, we are used to and evolved to having community with like a small number of people who are normally like people around us who we like see every day or regularly in some way, and we can like forge these kind of small connections that end up making us feel like we belong. And we're not trained to have community with millions of people simultaneously at once. Like that's just not something
Definitely.
we're very good at. And so maybe it's no surprise that these platforms aren't very good at it. But I'm curious, is there a way that we can develop practices, protocols, or even platforms that motivate people to share stories and knowledge and have connections in this social media way where if it's good, people will join and it'll get big? I know you've written about like reparative algorithms, and I'm curious if you're thinking through this like, well, things are going to scale, and so we will need technologies to sort things, but is there a way we can do that better?
Yeah, that's a hard question. Something that I think about often. So when I talk about reparation or repair, I'm always thinking about in instances where it makes sense to use technology as an intervention to make things better for marginalized people. And then also looking at instances where it would absolutely make it worse. And that the best intervention is no algorithmic intervention at all. Um, and to sort of like scale back on that and really undo a lot of the algorithmic systems that we have in place. I don't really know the answer. Like I'm working on this book right now and it just has been really interesting to think through all of these different scenarios in which we see algorithms in use. People talk about ethics, but then they don't actually explore what does it mean to be ethical in the creation, the development, and the implementation of these tech. And for me, that means you really have to be considering even the most marginalized, unlikely user, um, and thinking about how to reduce harm for those populations on your platform. And so if we think about like how do you scale that mindset, it's really hard to do that because algorithms operate on big data. That's the whole thing. But I do think that there are ways to be intentional about how you operationalize big data and how you create programs so that they can uplift rather than further marginalize. And I'm not a computer scientist, so I can't tell you the exact code, but I have computer scientist friends and I know it can be done. People just have to put in the work to do it.
Yeah, and of course there's always that question of like if it's technically possible, is it financially profitable? And that might be
Right.
where the rubber hits the road. But you have to think that there is because there's so many people who understand that there's something wrong with how we're engaging online. And it does seem to be like a brand risk for these companies. Whether it's dating apps and people are like not getting their matches, or whether it's Facebook and people are like, I don't want to see disinformation, or I don't want to see um, AI bot generated content, like
Right.
it seems like they maybe think that they have to do it a certain way to get money, but actually, maybe by centering the most marginalized, they might actually make the experience better for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only will they make it better for everybody, but they might also actually profit. That's the thing. I think Target is learning the hard way that when you say, oh, we're not going to have spaces where we are uplifting and celebrating people who traditionally weren't able to get employed. We're not going to stand by DEI. We're not going to support Black businesses, small Black businesses in our stores anymore. We're not going to do that. It's just going to be free market. Whoever comes to the table comes to the table. And look what they found out. Sure, your store can be all white if you want it to be, but your shareholders will not be happy. And I think that's what people have to start understanding is that it's not just about the performativity and the politics, but it's actually that people enjoy equity, people enjoy diversity. People are looking for it. People are looking for representations of themselves and the products that they buy and in the media that they consume. And if the people who are making these decisions can tap into that, even if it's just for profit, then there you go. You have your profit, right? People want to shop where they feel respected. That's just like a no-brainer. Um, People want to use technology where they feel respected. So of course you can be profitable and be ethical. You just have to adjust your framing and then actually design to be ethical and safe and equitable.
Yeah, I completely agree. And to even take it out of social media, when you look at the history of just creative media in the United States, whenever these companies have let in the doors to people who they had previously refused, all of a sudden all these innovations happen. I mean, the American music tradition is like kind of the case study of all this, right? Like from like every single American music genre has started with Black people and made
Mhm.
companies incredibly wealthy and also made American culture incredibly popular globally. Um, every single genre from gospel, jazz, country, rock, blues, R&B,
Say
pop
that
music.
because that's why they're so mad at Beyonce right now because they think she stole something, but she's just doing something that we already did. Y'all stole it. She's just doing it better. And
And,
that's why you salty.
and that's why I love this whole trilogy. We're getting on a Beyonce tangent.
I know.
I just feel like I love this whole trilogy, the Renaissance, the because she's reclaiming all these genres that Black people invented, and
hmm
like just showing people like y'all need us. Like you want to be anti-DEI, fine, but this is gonna be real boring. America
Right.
music is gonna be really boring, and you're not gonna like it if you don't like let us in and let us have value. But I also think about in the online social media space how platforms have been so indebted to various diverse forms of cultural production. Like Twitter would not have been Twitter without Black Twitter. Like
Definitely.
Vine would not have been Vine without Black people, and therefore there would not have been a TikTok because that's what they were looking at, right? Like
Right.
there, I mean, even Lisa Nakamura writes about Tila Tequila and MySpace and how like she was
hmm
the original influencer, or Black Planet creating the like original templates for social media, Asia Avenue. Like when you let us in, like everybody benefits. And actually we come up with ways to use the technology in ways that like show everyone else what its value actually is.
Right.
Um, I'm thinking when you to get back to this reparative algorithms thing, you said uplift, and I just want to like because we are talking about uplifting, right, as opposed to sorting and segregating and
Yeah,
siloing.
absolutely. Yeah, so really it's like uplift, but honestly, it's really just getting rid of that colorblind framing. So
Mm.
often what we see in tech is that in an attempt to be in an attempt towards equality, not equity, but equality, they say, oh, we're just going to treat everybody the same. And if we do that, we have equality. And whoever rises to the top of, let's say, like a job application stack, they just got there because of merit. Even if we're using algorithmic sorting, the algorithm is going to pick the best people for the job, right? But what people don't know or that we maybe don't think about is that actually the algorithm itself is biased to pick out what it thinks is quote unquote the best. So if you have a bunch of people putting Harvard on their CV versus Sarah Lawrence, which is a women's college, um, the bias is that Harvard is elite and typically white male, right? So it's going to pick up on that and it's going to push those people to the top of the stack. So really, when we say like elevate, we're saying take off that bias lens, the bias lens where you're using color blindness and saying we're all equal, recognizing that actually, though as human value, as humans, we all have the same intrinsic value. Our circumstances are not always equal, and that's fine. And saying, oh, wow, this person actually had a 4.9 GPA at Sarah Lawrence and they were the top of their class. This person had a 2.8 GPA at Harvard and they were a slacker their whole time, right? That's a completely different thing. That's a completely different conversation. And frankly, I'd rather hire the other person, the person who has worked hard. They're at a smaller school, they're at the top of their class, and they're making those commitments, right? So the systems don't necessarily think in nuance. Well, they don't think, they don't program in nuance. And so really there has to be a way of, yes, using algorithms and algorithmic tools in combination with humans who can actually do the labor of helping contextualize better.
Yeah, I love that. Like humans matter.
Humans matter. Imagine.
Breaking news, y'all. I mean, but it is like concerning that we're in this kind of AI age. The studies are showing that AI, because they're probabilistic, just like algorithms, they use algorithms and machine learning. They're based on biased data sets. They're putting out biased data. That's not even very factual or good half the time, to be honest. But it seems like there's a push from these big tech companies to automate everything, um, and not pay humans. I feel like it's a lot of just corporate cost savings. Like we just
Oh,
don't,
for sure.
you know. Um, but at the same time, companies that are adopting this are like, well, actually, I need to hire more humans because it's so biased and inefficient, and like I need to make sure that things are actually getting done well. So I
And
feel
accurately.
accurately, right? Like machines can only do so much.
Yeah, so I'm in a group chat with a bunch of colleagues at Michigan, and we all asked ChatGPT, who wrote our books. And out of like 5 or 6 of us, it only got 1 right, and I think it was the dude who's in our group. Everyone else, it attributed to completely different people, and most of us are women, and it attributed our work to men. So I'm
Wow.
asking like ChatGPT, like, "Who wrote my book?" And it's like, "Oh, this dude wrote it." And I was like, "No, he didn't."
And people listening, maybe you've not written a book, but academic books are so much work. It
Yeah.
takes years, and we put so much work into those things. That is so offensive.
Right. And then to think like these are the same systems that our students are using when they're doing their papers that they should be writing, but they're using ChatGPT. And it's like, okay, you're using this faulty system to write your paper based on faulty information. So it's over here talking about this is the theory of blah, blah, blah. And then actually, that person didn't even ever think about that. That's a completely different discipline. The theory is all wrong, and here you are turning in a paper that's going to get you an F, and you could have just did the work and had an A. But we don't talk about that, right? Like it's not just, oh, you're having ChatGPT write your paper. It's like you're having ChatGPT write you a bad paper.
Yeah, and I think people don't get the connection between that and just like statistical thinking, like when you're designing something to just kind of meet this kind of curve, which is kind of like, like the IQ curve or whatever, right? Like it's so tied up in these like racialized notions of like who has value, and it doesn't honor those edge cases. It doesn't honor the specificity needed to actually like identify the worth, value, efficacy of something, and
Right.
it's like when you think that you could just average things out and it's okay, this is where you end up. You actually end up with something worse than if you just put in the work, like you were saying, to just like make sure things are representative and good and fair.
Right.
Um, so I'm curious then if you've thought about like I feel like, I don't want to spill all your tea, but you've talked about maybe that you might think about one day designing your own kind of platform or something. Yeah, so if you were to have your own app and just design it from scratch, what would you do? How would you design something better?
Yeah, so I thought about this a lot when I was writing my first book, Not My Type, Automating Sexual Racism and Online Dating, where I met with 100 people from across various racial backgrounds and ethnicities and talked about their experiences on dating apps. And then also looked at a bunch of dating app patents and really dug into how things are set up and how they're framed. And now that I'm working on my next book with Jenny Davis, From Fair to Repair, Algorithmic Futures and the Case for Redress, I've been thinking about a reparative dating app and what that could look like. So I've been thinking about this a lot as I've been working on this book. Because in one of the chapters we come up with some speculative designs, and it's literally the chapter I'm working on right now is where I talk about the speculative reparative redesign of a dating app. And it's been a long time coming. I This chapter is like the final hold up to finishing the book. Um, but the things that I think are key that like in my mind they're so easy to do. First is expanding your safety guide. When I say your, I mean dating companies. Expanding your community guidelines and your clauses to say we don't tolerate racial harassment, we don't tolerate discrimination, we don't tolerate racial fetishization. Um, you know, in public, I guess you could say, because I know some people that's their kink. And if that's you, like, I love that for you. But seek consent first, right? And it's difficult to do that if you're just putting your kink out there on a profile or chasing someone down and leading with your kink before they've had a chance to consent, right? Um, but really just doing that, saying that we have a no tolerance policy for these things would save so many people so much pain. Um, and then also making a reporting space where individuals can actually go and report racial harassment. Because in my interviews of talking to these 100 folks that I did for my book, my first book on online dating, one of the things they said is like, I don't ever make a report when I experience racial harassment because I don't think that they'll care. I don't think that they're going to follow up with me. No one cares about this kind of stuff unless it's like sexual violence. Then nobody really cares, right? And it shouldn't be the case that it's treated any differently. Um, that's a huge piece of it. And then along those same lines is really expanding our definition of safety in general. We can't claim that we are doing trust and safety on platforms and in platform design if we aren't considering the whole person. So it can't just be physical safety, it needs to be emotional well being, psychological safety. And if you're a person of color and you're constantly encountering no fats, no femmes, no Asians, or no blacks, no whoever, that's not psychological safety. You can't show up to a space and be your authentic self and be ready to like find a kink partner or a hookup partner or a partner for life if you are feeling like you have to hide and always be on the defensive because you're in a hostile space. So those are the two sort of like key things I really think that we have to broaden and sort of move past these very white centric ideas about what safety is. I often find that platforms' idea of safety is about protecting white women and like white women's virtue. And we have to move past that.
Yeah, being really expansive about who's included in the safety conversation and what safety means is just so smart. And like you said, so basic. It really goes back to just things that we have done in our communities, right? Like
Mm,
you go to a church, right? Like this would not be tolerated, right? You go to a community
right.
center, a public space, a public library. This would not be tolerated. And so it shouldn't be tolerated digitally either. I remember in my 20s, like seeing those no blacks things and like the psychological toll that that took, especially at that formative age, where I just thought I was unattractive. Like I just thought like I would never find love and I wasn't deserving of love because there were these people out there, even if they were the minority, basically saying that who I am, the thing that I cannot change, is not valuable.
Okay.
And it took me a long time to like actually build up self-esteem, like in that context, as someone who grew up with like online dating apps.
Of course, yeah. And like, of course it would be that way where you're constantly seeking validation and affirmation from your peers, and they're constantly, not always, but often in these mainstream white dating spaces saying that you are outside of what is desirable. Of course, you're going to internalize that, especially so young when you're like in your 20s, you're just figuring out who you are. And yeah, you're really vulnerable to internalizing these negative messages about yourself. And the other thing I sort of wanted to add too, in terms of what could be reparative in dating apps specifically, is not just relying on AI content moderation. We got to cut that out. Like we know it doesn't work. Google has found that it doesn't work well. Twitter has found that it doesn't work well back when Twitter was doing that. It doesn't work well if you only rely on AI because humans are so diverse and our language is so diverse, even within English. You can't you can't flag someone the same way for saying the N word with an A on the end versus an ER on the end, right? And often these systems are going to flag that and say, oh, this is hate speech, this is that, this is toxic, it's inflammatory. And it's like, actually, this is just cultural. Now, are you flagging it when it's a hard ER? That part, I don't know. I don't know if they always are, right? So it's like we need people with cultural training and cultural context who can say, okay, I'm looking at this, I'm looking at the entire conversation, and this is actually okay. They were just having a conversation, they were having a kiki, everybody's fine, right? Versus this is outright racial violence and they need to be removed from the app.
Yeah, there's I'm curious if you've seen like are these platforms doing that not just with text but also with image? I
Yeah.
know there's like this like there's also like they underpay workers overseas to like look at images and improve them or whatever. But I've talked to friends of mine who are black who are like, I can't even post a photo of myself like in a Speedo because it's flagged as like inappropriate. But then I see white users on these gay apps and they're like almost nude. It's like
Right.
totally fine. Like there's these biases just in like what is perceived as harmful based on who is saying it and who is doing it.
Definitely. Yeah, I've definitely seen that with the image detectors as well, where even people who, let's say, exist in a larger body size will get flagged more readily than a thin person because their chest is bustier or they're showing quote unquote more skin, but it's just because their body is actually larger. Like if you are a large person in a bikini, yes, you're showing more skin, but if the algorithm is just going based off of this percentage of skin has been detected in the photo, then yeah, your like 50% is maybe closer to someone else's 80%. And yeah, it's going to get flagged, which it's like, okay, just use a human to verify this stuff before you act on that and give someone a community violation or remove them from the platform or whatever it is.
Yeah, it goes back to Joy Billinghouli's like Gender Shades project, where she just looked at facial recognition technology, and you could tell that it wasn't trained on diverse data sets because it could not identify women and queer people and people of color, differently body size people, like, and it is based on like what you have trained your data on, what you have corrected for as the norm, and then the trusting of the machine over just like our own eyes,
Mhm.
own like brains. Um, so we've kind of gone through like some of the things we would change. I feel like a lot of this is, like you're saying, it's kind of back to basic stuff, and it's really for me a lot about like just accountability is a community driven practice. And we've just always had humans moderating what is right and wrong in society. And not like we've done it perfectly, not like there wasn't bias
Right.
or algorithms, but when you train algorithms on what we've been doing, the biases are then encoded and almost like amplified.
Definitely.
Um, is there in that context um, anything that you think is worth preserving on these platforms? Anything that is a good thing that you like and you would like to see embedded in any new platforms or any new technologies? And, if there was something where you could just flip a switch and say, we're not doing that anymore, what would that be?
Yeah. I'll start with the second part. So I think if I could have people not put their racial preferences in profiles, um, and just like we're not doing that anymore, that would be great to me personally. I know some people are split on this. They're sort of like, I'd rather know if someone's a racist before. I kind of think they're just not going to swipe on you if they're a racist, but maybe they
Right.
will because people like to troll. So maybe that is legit. But I would love to see no racial preferences on profiles. No like skin tone preferences. Just wipe all of that away. I don't actually think we need it. It doesn't make a difference, right? Like there is no biological significance of those things. Culturally, yes, of course, there are cultural ideas that we've attached to those notions, but I think that you can work that out with someone in a conversation rather than having it in a profile. Um, Things that I like, that's a little bit more challenging. So I'd say like outside of the dating space in particular, I really like Threads. I just want it to stay the way that it is. I'm like, please don't change Threads. I know they're going to. Like Mark Zuckerberg, if you watch this, I know you're going to change it. That's a mistake, but you know, they're going to do what they're going to do, right? Um, which like Mark Zuckerberg probably isn't going to watch this, but that's why he's not doing right because he should be.
Definitely.
um,
It's the hard question, isn't it? It's kind of like
it's hard.
it's been tough for people to be like, there are so many problems.
There's so many problems. Um, you know what I will say? Something that I like about Reddit is the like bot moderators. They come with a quickness. Sometimes it's a bot, sometimes it's a person, it seems like, and they are like, nope, you violated the community guides. And then what I like about it is that they tell you exactly what you did.
Hmm.
So they will give you a list, like, this is our community guideline, and this is how you violated. This is why your post has been removed. I really like that component of education while you are setting a boundary. I think that's really healthy, and we need to see more of that in our digital spaces.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I don't use Reddit, so I wasn't aware of that. So that's really informative. And I've heard good things about Reddit. I mean, maybe it is because for so long it was a human moderated space. And I know
Mhm.
that there's also been transformations into how they do that, and they've maybe been more rigorous about how they choose moderators or whatever. Um, but it does maybe show the value of if you're going to have a bot, have it be trained on many, many years of human-based moderation first.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's all the questions I had. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a fun time.